So that's clear. Now, Avi Melamed is an independent intelligence analyst and a former Israeli intelligence official and founder of the ITME, Inside the Middle East Institute. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. So we have the US president threatening another obliteration, then changing his mind after holding talks with Iran that Tehran said did not happen. Who are you believing in this scenario?
All of them and none. What we are looking at is part of what I have illustrated since day one of this war as the poker game. We are constantly looking at the different players involved in this poker game, and each one is trying to its best of capacities to first take advantage of the strong cards in its possession and at the same time to try to take leverage on the weak cards on the hands of the rivalry. So in the end of the day, I think that we could look at all this recent, I would say, couple of hours pendulum, so to speaking, in the context of this poker game.
Okay, and this is normally how these sorts of negotiations play out, is it? You're a man who has seen, okay, we can lie, but we can lie strategically. We can say, we can tell a little bit of truth about this, or we can tell a little bit of truth about that. We can just lie about that, and everybody's playing the same game.
Correct, very correct. We could see it very clearly.
Right.
Every player leaves itself what we call the space for denial, sort of speaking, or a space for maneuvering, and this is exactly what we are seeing right now.
You talked about the cards that each has to play. What are the strong cards that Iran is playing? Clearly, the Strait of Hormuz is an ace that it's holding on to.
Yes, that's one of the cards, even though it has some kind of like a downsize in a way. But in addition to that, Iran has some other strong cards. For example, the fact that the Iranian regime has a very clear strategic objective, and that is to remain in power. And seemingly at this point, at least in the short future, is going to obtain that capacity, that objective. The second powerful card that the regime has in its possession is the fact that he doesn't care about his people. So the meaning of that is that the endurance capacity of that regime is much more bigger, I would say, in comparison, let's say, to the endurance capacities of its neighbors, the Arab Gulf states. The fact that the Mullah regime, as you mentioned earlier, accurately has control at the Hormuz Strait is, of course, another significant power card, and the fact that he can, and he has been doing since day one of the war, deliberately and intentionally targeting its neighbors, the Arab Gulf monarchies, and particularly focusing on the gas and oil energy infrastructure is deliberate, because the purpose beyond that is simply to create a global economic crisis, and thus through that to put pressure on the United States to stop the war.
It's very interesting, and this is a point that I've heard before, and it's good that you are clarifying it like that. So the Iranian objective is to stay in power. That's clear. Does that mean that this war ends only by negotiation or with the complete obliteration, to use Donald Trump's word, of that regime?
No, I don't think this war ends with complete obliteration. We have to be realistic. Iran is a huge state. It's a 90 million people nation. The Iranian regime, thus far, though sustained a significant damage, is still standing on its feet. So I think that we should be more realistic. I think that in the end of the day, we are heading towards some sort of like a diplomatic backtrack diplomacy that have to do in the end of the day with ending this crisis, this conflict, with some sort of like a diplomatic agreement.
If that happens, if Washington and Tehran do come to some sort of diplomatic agreement, do you think that will mean an end to Israeli strikes?
Yes. In the end of the day, when we are talking in the context again of the poker game, one of the most significant things that we have to be aware of is the fact that in the end of the day, Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies that have been constantly threatened and attacked by the Mullah regime, in the end of the day must be tuned to the decisions that are done in the White House. And so once President Trump will call the day off, that means that both Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies, of course, have to be on the same line with him.
Going back to the Strait of Hormuz question, why do you think Washington appears to have been caught so off guard by the Iranian decision to block the Strait and send oil prices through the roof?
I don't know to say if they have been caught off guard. I think that this is something that probably was calculated within the different war scenarios that have been portrayed before the war started. I think that in a way, it wasn't seems like on top of priorities in terms of like the way that the American war planners were trying to assess what will be the Iranian move. There has been some good reasons for them to think that this card of the Hormuz Strait will not be necessarily the card Iran will rush to flush, sort of speaking, and to use. But we find ourselves in a situation where, in the end of the day, the Iranians actually kind of like fulfill what they have threatened all the time, saying like, we will significantly damage world trade, and particularly trade of the crude oil. Some 20% of the world's crude oil is going to this enormously strategic location. The Iranians fulfill what they have been threatening to do all those years. I think that this is something that has been viewed by the American side war planners as something that may happen down the road, and maybe there was some sort of like an estimation within the American war planners that given the magnitude of the early phase strikes and the severe damage caused to the Mullah regime and its infrastructure, we will not find ourselves in that position. Apparently, there has been some sort of like, let's call it miscalculation.
So let's look at that regional aspect of this war, because the conflict is now stretching across the Gulf as well as Israel and Lebanon. Is this a regional war in all but name?
Yes and no, because this is a war that in the end of the day, as you accurately mentioned, stretches beyond the physical dimension of Iran and the Arab Gulf monarchies. You mentioned Lebanon. This is very significant. There is something here we have to understand when we look at the large geostrategic picture of the region. The Mullah regime in Tehran has been leading a very aggressive expansion policy throughout the region during the last couple of decades, actually to a large extent occupying through network of armed armies like the Hezbollah or Hamas or Islamic Jihad, occupying large Arab territories. At some point, the Mullah regime actually had control over Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Gaza Strip, and influence in Yemen. And so the Mullah regime has inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the region for the last couple of decades, and not less significant is the fact that while doing that, the Mullah regime remained totally immune from any repercussions and ramifications. As far as the Mullah regime is concerned, up until recently, the master plan of expansion and taking over the region was working very well at the service of the Mullah regime. The turning point was October 7 attack launched by Hamas that resulted in a domino effect, right, a chain reaction, if you wish. And now we are witnessing a very dramatic component of this chain reaction, and this is the war with Iran. So the weakening of the Mullah regime, which is very clear what's happening right now. I'm not talking about downfall, but I'm talking about significant weakening of the Mullah regime, as in it for itself, could be a good news to the region, provided there will be a couple of things coming along with that. First, that the Mullah regime will not have the ability, obviously, to break through to creation of a nuclear military capacities. The other thing is that the Mullah's regime ballistic missiles industry will be some kind of like under monitoring, so to put it this way. The third thing, which is very significant, is to make sure that the proxies of the Mullah regime will not be able to regroup themselves, and particularly when we are talking about Hezbollah. And one of the observations that I will offer is that once and even when the war with Iran is coming to an end, I think that we should expect the continuation of the war between Israel and Hezbollah.
Right.
The Israeli government is determined to end the threat that the Hezbollah presents to Israel. And by doing that, we could expect also, relatively speaking, hopefully, positive impact in the context of the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, so let's finish where we started with these talks between Washington and Tehran that only one side say is happening. If you and I were to speak a week from now, following those talks/non-talks, what do you think the situation in Iran is most likely to be? What are we likely to be talking about a week from now?
A week from now, we are looking at the Iranian regime that finds itself, on the one hand, in an unprecedented situation in the sense that it has sustained a significant blow to its military capacities, to its military industry, an Iranian regime that still stands on its feet, but it's quite of like shaky, but still standing on its feet. An Iranian regime that is reminding you that Iran is dealing with an enormous inner challenges in addition to the war, economically, socially, and so on and so on. And an Iranian regime that is dealing with millions of Iranian people that loathe that regime. The big question, of course, is whether we are going to see the burst of the reignition of the Iranian uprising that we saw last January. It's an open question, right. But I think that will be the situation in Iran. So I think that it's very clear that the Iranian regime will try to, as soon as possible, to regroup itself, to reassure its control on the ground, yet it will be done in quite different conditions in comparison to the conditions before the war. And as I mentioned before, for the Iranian regime is definitely yet another significant milestone of exam, sort of speaking, regarding its ability to continue and to endure and to remain in power. I don't think that we should look, at least not in the foreseeable future, I don't think that we are looking at the downfall of the regime, but I think that we could expect some sort of like an inner political configuration within Iran because of the accumulation of all those circumstances and conditions I just mentioned. And I think that a desirable outcome and realistic outcome of such process would be a much more effective participation of large segments of the Iranian people who have been basically removed or remote from power, in the sense that it will kind of like result in maybe, hopefully, down the road, a creation of a new governmental system in Iran that will be, let's put it this way, much more cooperative and much less destructive than the Mullah regime that took control over Iran in 1979.
Good talking to you, Avi. Thank you so much for joining us. Avi Melamed, independent intelligence analyst.
Thank you for having me.